Helen squeezed through the crowded coffee shop, balancing 3 cups of espresso and a piece of chocolate cake on a tray. The smell of freshly ground coffee mixed with the aromas of vanilla and cinnamon, creating the illusion of comfort that she needed so much right now. In reality, her thoughts were far away in the hospital, where her brother was struggling with pain again, and the doctors were no longer hiding their despair. "Helen, hurry up, a table by the window is waiting," the manager shouted, urging her on in a sharp tone. She gritted her teeth and hurried to the right table, but when she put the cups in front of the customer, her heart skipped a beat. In front of her sat Marcus Devlin himself, a billionaire, owner of a chain of elite hotels, a man whom no one dared to ignore. Cold calculation was red in his dark eyes, but when he looked at her, interest flickered in his gaze. "Helen, right?" His voice was low, enveloping. She nodded, looking at him in amazement. How did he know her name? "Sit down. We need to talk." "Excuse me, but I'm at work." She tried to remain professional, but her voice betrayed her. "This is more important than your work," he answered confidently. "I know about your situation. About your brother. And I have an offer for you." Helen clutched the tray, her heart pounding in her chest. He knew about her brother? But how? "I can pay for the operation, the treatment, and everything else that's needed." His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "In exchange for this, you will marry me. For a year. And bear me an heir." The world around her seemed to collapse. A wave of anger, fear, and hope swept over her. $1 million. Saving her brother. A future without debt and constant night shifts. But at what cost? "Why me?" Her voice was barely audible. Marcus leaned closer, his expensive perfume enveloping her, mixing with the smell of coffee. "Because you are perfect for this role. And you have no choice." Helen felt panic rising in her. This was a deal with the devil. But she really had no choice. "You have 24 hours to think about it," he continued, taking out a business card and placing it on the table. "I expect an answer tomorrow at noon." With that, he stood up and left, leaving her sitting at the table with trembling hands. What would she say tomorrow? Helen sat across from Marcus in his luxurious office, feeling the air between them saturated with something heavy and inevitable. Expensive furniture, a massive oak table, the dim light of expensive lamps. She felt small and insignificant in this world of money and power. "You do realize that this marriage is just a contract, right?" Marcus's voice was low, calm, but there was an icy certainty in it. Helen clenched her hands into fists under the table, trying to hide her trembling. "Yes, I understand." Her voice was firm, but inside, everything was screaming with fear. He nodded, as if assessing her resolve. "For a year, you will live in my house, follow certain rules, and," his gaze lingered on her face for a second. "You will bear me a child." Helen swallowed hard. "And after that?" "After that, you will have your freedom and $1 million, a smile tugged at his lips, "if, of course, you fulfill your end of the agreement." She hated that cold tone, that certainty with which he said those words. But she had no choice. She remembered how a few days ago the doctor had told her that her brother's operation was the only chance for life. Without her, he might not live to see next year. Helen took a deep breath. "Okay. I agree." Marcus leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly to the side, as if studying her. "Tomorrow you will have a new home, a new name, and a new life. I hope you are ready for that." The next day was a whirlwind of events. Helen signed the papers that the notary laid out in front of her. Her name was now officially changed. There was no wedding as such, just a formal signing at the city hall, cold signatures, stamps. The only person present at the ceremony was Marcus's personal lawyer. And then she was taken to her new home. No. To the castle. Marcus's mansion was located outside the city, surrounded by high wrought iron gates and guards. Stone walls, columns, huge windows, marble floors. Everything seemed unreal, as if she had entered an alien, too luxurious world. She was met by her maid, a woman in a formal suit, with a straight posture and a stern gaze. "Mr. Marcus is already waiting for you in the dining room." Helen climbed the stairs, her legs buckling from fatigue and excitement. When she entered the dining room, Marcus was sitting at the head of the long oak table, like a king in his castle. "Sit down," he said without emotion. Helen sat down carefully across from him, her eyes never leaving his. He studied her, his dark eyes as deep and impenetrable as the night sky. "Get used to it," he said finally. "From now on, you live here." She took a sip of water, trying to swallow the bitter feeling in her chest. "This isn't a home," she said quietly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "This is a cage." He leaned forward, his gaze burning into her. "It all depends on how you look at it, Helen. Caged or not, you are my wife now. And you had better realize that soon." His words sounded like a warning. Helen realized this year would be long. Very long. Night fell on Marcus's mansion, shrouding its majestic walls in darkness. The huge windows reflected the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance an antique clock ticked monotonously. In this luxury, Helen felt like a stranger. She lay on a wide bed, but sleep did not come. Every thought brought her back to today. To Marcus's cold gaze, his commanding voice, the words that sounded like a sentence. "Now you are my wife." These words stretched in her mind, causing mixed feelings, fear, anger, but also something elusive. There was a knock on the door. Helen tensed. "Yes?" The door opened, and a silhouette appeared in the doorway. Marcus. He was wearing only an unbuttoned shirt, dark trousers, and a look from which it was impossible to hide. "You are not sleeping," more a statement than a question. "Are you watching me?" He chuckled, entering the room. "I know everything in this house." Helen sat up in bed, pulling the covers over her as if they could protect her from him. "What do you want?" Marcus came closer. She felt his aura fill the space. "We need to get this straight," his voice was low, like a muffled fire. Helen looked at him, not looking away. "You made a deal with me, Helen. But you don't fully understand what you're getting yourself into." She clutched the covers tighter. "Don't you think you should have explained this sooner?" Marcus smiled. "I only give people as much information as they're willing to accept. You were only willing to accept the amount I offered. Now, it's time to learn the rest." He sat down next to her, their shoulders almost touching. "This year won't be easy. You think your main goal is to give me an heir, but that's only part of the game. The real challenge is surviving it." Helen tensed. "What are you talking about?" Marcus leaned closer so she could feel the warmth of his skin. "There are rules in this house. And there are those who want you to break them." She felt a chill run down her spine. "You're scaring me." He touched her chin, lifting it, forcing her to look him straight in the eyes. "That's right." She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. "You're not the first one in this situation, Helen. And some of them didn't make it." Her heart began to beat faster. "You mean your wives?" "Some of them are missing," he answered calmly. The air in the room grew thick, almost tangible. Helen couldn't breathe. "Are you threatening me?" Marcus gently ran his finger down her cheek. "No. I'm warning you." He stood up, leaving her speechless, and headed for the door. "Sleep, Helen. Tomorrow will be a long day." The door closed behind him, leaving her in a frightening silence. Now she knew for sure this year would be the most dangerous game of her life. And losing could cost her not only her freedom, but her very life. Helen woke up with the feeling that she was being watched. The room was dark, but she clearly felt the presence of something invisible. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breathing quickened. She sat up abruptly in bed, peering into the darkness. Silence. Only the barely audible ticking of the clock and the faint noise of the wind outside the windows. Just my imagination, Helen tried to calm herself. But the feeling of anxiety did not go away. She stood up, throwing a robe over her shoulders, and carefully approached the door. The door handle was cold to the touch. Opening the door, Helen looked out into the hallway. Nothing. The huge mansion was immersed in semi-darkness, only rare wall lamps cast weak reflections on the dark floor. She wanted to go back to the room, but suddenly noticed something strange. A woman was standing at the end of the hallway. A slender figure in a long nightgown. Her hair fell over her shoulders, and her face was hidden in shadow. Helen held her breath. "Who are you?" The woman didn't move. Helen took a step forward, but as soon as she blinked, the silhouette disappeared. A chill ran down her skin. Was it a dream? Or had she really seen someone? There was a sharp sound of footsteps behind her. Helen turned around to see Marcus standing in front of her. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse, but calm. She swallowed. I heard a noise." Marcus gave her a long look, then looked at the end of the hallway where the mysterious woman had just stood. "And what did you see?" Helen hesitated, but then answered. "There was a woman." Marcus froze, his jaw tensing. "A woman?" "Yes. In a long dress, but when I blinked, she was gone." Marcus was silent for a few seconds, then suddenly grabbed her hand and turned her towards him. "Listen to me carefully, Helen. If you see anyone in this hallway again, just go back to your room and forget about it." An icy fear gripped her. "But who is she?" Marcus gritted his teeth. "It's none of your business." He turned and walked down the hallway without looking back. Helen was left standing alone, feeling anxiety rising inside her. What was he hiding? And who had she just seen? One thing was clear, this house held many more secrets than it seemed at first glance. And she was ready to reveal every single one of them. The next morning, Helen couldn't get what she had seen that night out of her head. Who was that mysterious woman? Why had Marcus changed the subject so abruptly? She decided that she would not sit idly by any longer. When Marcus left for work, she went to explore the mansion. Long corridors, antique furniture, huge portraits of strangers, everything here seemed to be steeped in secrets. But one door in particular caught her attention. Old, massive, with a brass lock tarnished by time. She tried the handle, it was locked. Her heart began to beat faster. Suddenly, a voice was heard nearby. "You can't come in here." Helen turned around abruptly and saw the housekeeper, an elderly woman with a piercing gaze. "What room is this?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "It's a piece of the past that's best left alone," she replied dryly. Helen pressed her lips together. What was behind that door? Later that night, when the whole house was asleep, Helen took the set of keys she'd found in Marcus's study and returned to the mysterious door. Her heart pounded as one of the keys fit. The lock clicked. She cautiously stepped inside. The room was cold, smelling of dust and something long forgotten. There were photographs on the walls. The woman she'd seen in the hallway was looking back at her from the old pictures. Helen covered her mouth with her hand. It was Marcus's wife. She glanced at the newspaper clippings lying on the table. The mysterious disappearance of Marcus' wife. The police closed the case due to lack of evidence. Is the ghost of the past alive? A chill ran down her spine. She hadn't disappeared. She had died. And maybe Marcus knew more about it than he was letting on. You weren't supposed to see that, Helen. She froze. Marcus stood in the doorway. There was no anger or panic in his eyes. Just weariness. Is that true? Her voice shook. Did you kill her? Marcus closed his eyes, then sighed heavily. No. Then why didn't you say anything? Because I don't know who did it. Helen looked at him, trying to figure out if he was lying or not. But she's here, Marcus. I saw her. His gaze wavered. She can't be here. Then who walks the halls at night? Marcus came closer, his hands on her shoulders. I don't know. But now you're in danger. The next few days were excruciating. Helen felt like she was being watched. The shadows in the mansion came alive. Whispers behind the walls, light footsteps in the hallway at night, muffled sounds that shouldn't be there. Marcus rarely left her alone. But even his presence couldn't cause the growing sense of sound. And then, in the dead of night, the door to her room slowly opened. Helen woke up with an icy feeling that someone was standing next to her. In the moonlight streaming through the window, she saw a silhouette. Tall, thin, with long, disheveled hair. She screamed. Helen! Marcus burst into the room, a gun in his hands. The figure stepped back. Who are you? His voice was tense, his hand clutching the gun tightly. The silhouette moved, and the moonlight illuminated the face. It was the woman with the portraits. Catherine? Marcus exhaled. The woman, his dead wife, looked at him with empty eyes and whispered. You remain on my throne. The truth that should have come out. Catherine was not a ghost. She was alive. Marcus learned the truth later, when the police detained her. His first wife suffered from a rare personality disorder bordering on insanity. Several years ago, she thought of faking her own English to punish Marcus for his lack of attention. But something went wrong, and she found herself locked in a secret room hidden behind old panels. All this time, she lived in the weaker ones, gradually losing her mind, until she decided to take revenge. She watched Marcus. Helen. Their obvious connection. But ultimately, her game led to her arrest. And Marcus was finally able to let go of the past. Epilogue. After all the shock, Helen packed her things, pretending. You don't have to keep that promise, she told Marcus. It all happened as a deal, and now. He took her hand. And now it's not a deal, he said firmly. It's love. She looked into his eyes, still hesitating. Are you sure? Absolutely, Marcus came closer, cupping her face in his hand. I don't want to lose you. Not after everything we've been through. Helen felt her heart fill with warmth. This was the foundation. Their path had been dangerous, with the absolute past and cruel secrets. But now that the storm had passed, they had a chance. For love. In a new life. For happiness that no one could destroy.